room.
Just press the red button to see if that changes things.
Yeah, okay. That's everybody coming in now. Okay, so it's good to see yourself and Paul there, and so I'll just confirm that the meeting has been held in hybrid format, and that anyone's attending Starleaf, most people are all attending Starleaf. So, Emer, we've got a quorum.
You have.
Okay, so we'll just make sure it's live and press the red button. Is that done?
That is done. You're broadcasting in public now.
Okay, so are there any apologies, Emer?
None received.
Okay, no worries.
Chair, apology from William Humphrey.
Okay, no bother. Tom, has he proxied his vote to you?
Yeah.
Okay, has Emer got that in writing?
And she might not have in writing now, no. He come to me this morning, through to me this morning to say he couldn't be here, apologise, and he would put the votes through. Now, I didn't contact him on that, but that's... Okay. But we'll leave it at whatever way it goes.
Okay, no worries, Tom. No worries, Tom. Listen, we'll record William's apologies. And so, in terms of the draft minutes, the minutes of the 17th of November are at page 5 of our pack. Are we content to agree those minutes? Agreed. Okay. There are no matters arising, but just to accommodate members' diaries, we have reordered the items of business from the agenda that were previously circulated. So I just want to confirm each item as we look at each of them in turn. So what I want to do is the inquiry into legislative consent motions and the briefing by Reveiw as part of our committee into legislative consent motion procedures. Additional research was commissioned to seek to understand better the LCM experience since January 2020 here in the Assembly, and indeed just to compare that with other devolved legislators. So at page 43 of our pack is a paper from Emer, which provides the context for today's briefing from Reveiw, and in my opinion very ably sets out the next steps that need to be undertaken going forward in our inquiry. Also in tabled items of our packs is a revised research paper and Annex A from Reveiw. So are the members content to note these papers? Yeah. Noted. So today we're joined by Emma Dallow-Perry from Reveiw. So I just want to welcome Emma to the meeting and ask Emma to begin her briefing to the committee.
Good afternoon, Chair. Thanks for bringing me in this afternoon. So this is a briefing on legislative consent motions since January 2020 up until November 2021. And as I'm sure the committee is aware, a legislative consent motion is a motion by which a devolved administration consents to the UK government legislating on an area of devolved policy. It's done under the Sewell Convention, and each individual devolved legislature has their own process for how they bring forward, scrutinise and then communicate that legislative consent to Westminster. So I won't bore the committee by going in depth into the different procedures for obtaining legislative consent and how they vary between Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. But there are two principal differences in what is a fairly common procedure of Minister brings forward consent motion, committee reports on it, legislature votes on that. So the first difference is in terms of scheduling of committee scrutiny. So the way it works in the Assembly is that it's meant to be around 10 days from the date the bill is introduced. The Minister then lays the legislative consent memorandum, which includes the motion in front of committee. The committee then has 15 working days to consider it. It's only Northern Ireland that limits the committee's consideration in that way in the standing orders. Scotland, for example, sets it up that the Parliamentary Bureau, their equivalent of our business committee, would schedule that scrutiny. For the Welsh Senate, it's the business committee, but either way, it's not set in stone in the standing orders how long the committee gets to scrutinise the LCM. It's actually set up in response to the challenges of the individual bill. So if I can just very quickly take members to Annex 1 just to show you the effect that can have. If I'll take you, for example, to the Birmingham and Commonwealth Games Act, which is the third one down in the table. So the bill was introduced in January. The consent memorandum was laid around about May 2020. There was correspondence between the committees and the department, but the actual royal assent was in June of 2020. So had the LCM been lodged at the right time and voted on at the right time, the Northern Ireland Assembly consideration of the LCM would have cleared up early March, perhaps. So that, and the royal assent didn't come through until June. So even in that very small example of a very short bill, you can see that there's 3 months there that could have been used for scrutiny that wasn't. So to bring you on to Annex 2 then, and the sort of comparison between the Scottish, the Welsh and the Northern Irish scrutiny of 3 separate bills, you'll see there the steps that are laid. Now, again, there's a bit of a health warning with this. This is, each Parliament has a different way of publishing their own LCM scrutiny. So just because something isn't here doesn't mean it never existed or it never happened. But this is just a reflection of what you can find out about the scrutiny of each particular LCM. So looking at the Agriculture Bill, as you can see, you start off in early January with it being introduced to the House of Commons. In February, the Committee on Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs take evidence. The legislative consent memorandum is voted on in Assembly in March. And then in November 2020, the Assembly gives consent. If you look at the Welsh consideration of the Agriculture Bill, it actually goes on until September 2020 from being introduced on, sorry, the LCM was agreed in March by the Assembly, and the LCM was agreed by September for the Senate. So the Senate actually had an extra 6 months to scrutinise the Agriculture Bill compared to the Assembly. And that experience then is repeated as you go through, as you look through the other pieces of legislation there. So that's the Internal Market Act as well, where no consent motion is recorded on the bill pages from the Assembly. So it just looks like there was no scrutiny from the bill pages perspective. Whereas if you look at the Senate again, you've got quite extensive detail on their consideration of their approach to scrutiny, when the scrutiny was timetabled, when it took place, and eventually there was correspondence sent in February 2021, starting from a starting point of September 2020. And again, if you look at the Public Services, Pension and Judicial Offices Bill, the time frame is significant because the Senate, for example, haven't finished their scrutiny, whereas we have. Ours was completed on the 1st of November 2021, I beg your pardon. So that gives you an idea of how much more scrutiny you can get done during the passage of a bill at Westminster if you don't limit yourself to that 15 days. And the other significant difference is in the refusal of legislative consent. So there are, a good example of this would be the European Union Withdrawal Bill. So there wasn't a legislative consent motion in the Northern Ireland Assembly about it, but there was a debate and correspondence was sent by the Speaker to reflect the will of the Assembly. I've seen that correspondence, I know it was sent, but that correspondence isn't published on the bill pages the way the refusal of legislative consent motions from Scotland and from the Senate are. So if you're an average person looking at those bill pages, you don't see the Assembly's contribution, which is significant. And again, as you look through the table in Annex 1, you will see that there are a number of pieces of legislation where the Assembly was asked to give legislative consent, but so far a motion hasn't been tabled or a memorandum hasn't been tabled. And because we don't record when we don't give consent, it's very hard to know if the Assembly refused consent or the motion wasn't tabled or what exactly is preventing that from being recorded. So those are the two significant differences and their consequences. Just to carry on with the remainder of the paper and to bring you back to the main body of the paper, we have then, as I've mentioned, the complexities about informing the UK Parliament. The frequency of the legislative consent motions has increased in the last couple of years. That is not solely a result of coronavirus legislation. So if you look at the analysis by the Institute for Government, which showed that in the first 20 years of devolution, there were about 220 acts that were passed at Westminster which required the consent of a devolved administration for an average of approximately 11 a year. Since January 2020, there have been approximately 30 acts which have required the consent of just the Assembly. So that's 15 a year. If you take out the 3 that were dealt with by coronavirus, you're leaving about 27 in just under 2 years. Now, that was true in about November, so it also depends on how you cut it. For example, the new health legislation is coming in separate LCMs, whereas that is one bill. So you can see where a bit of flexibility can be really useful. So to sort of summarise, although all the systems for granting legislative consent have similarities, the differences in Northern Ireland have real impacts on the scrutiny time available to committee, and thus the scrutiny of plenary as well when it's being debated in full. You've only got a limited amount of time to actually draft your report. And if you look at the departmental briefing and committee consideration columns in Annex 1, the committee will see that a number of committees have tried to work around this by, when they know the LCM is coming down the tracks, they arrange evidence sessions even though the LCM hasn't been formally lodged with the committee. Now, that's sensible. It does illustrate that need, but it's also not exactly desirable because it means that the committee's scrutinising an LCM it hasn't seen yet. And witnesses are responding on the basis of legislation when they're not entirely sure which bits will apply to Northern Ireland, which bits might be dealt with by another piece of legislation, and how the whole framework will fit together. So, just finally, to emphasise the point, because this is the increase in legislation, you would assume would be connected to the UK's exit from the EU. There will be more legislation coming down the track. As primary legislation, you'd anticipate that it would deal with devolved matters. So because of the complexity where devolution and the protocol and the post-EU exit legislation will meet, and then to add on top of that common frameworks, in order to keep the procedures correct and the governance correct, it's really important, I think, to consider how to tighten up and make more transparent the consideration of LCMs so that A, people know what's happening, but B, the committee also has the time to give the scrutiny that the subject deserves. So I know that's a very quick canter through. I'd be very happy to take any questions you have. Thanks for your patience so far.
Thank you, Emma. And you can see that the committee has tried to grapple with, the whole LCM process. People have come at this from different perspectives, but everybody feels the current system has more challenges than benefits for us. So one of the questions I have is, I suppose, you've set it out in annex, in the annex very helpfully, but are you aware of any recent example of ministers not laying the memorandum within 10 working days as set out in Standing Order 42A4?
Yes, absolutely. So the Advanced Research and Invention Agency Bill, I think the LCM was just lodged yesterday or possibly the day before. That was brought into Parliament on the 1st of March this year.
Right.
So that's quite some time now. But I should point out that the 10-day limit is not absolute. There's a bit of flex there, and I don't know why it hasn't been done until now. It could well be because amendments have been made that bring devolved competencies into play.
Okay. So even in your report, it's really, it's fair to conclude that 15 days for committee consideration isn't always required, particularly in cases where more time could be afforded. And given the date when the bill goes through the Commons, what other flexibilities do you think we need? In your opinion, I'm only asking, you don't have to answer, but certainly should we, consider changing our standing orders to allow for more time for scrutiny?
I do think that would be sensible insofar as it would bring us into line with all the other devolved administrations as well. And there are a number of instances in committee reports on legislative consent motions where the committee have pointed out that its time has been constrained. So the committees are actually making that same argument. They're saying 15 days isn't enough.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to pass it over to other members for questions. I can't see any hands raised now. It's not to say they're not. So I've got Nicola. Okay, I'll go with Nicola first.
Sorry, is that okay? Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Emma, for that there. I was just following on from Carol's point and the point you made at the end of your presentation about how this committee can hold the whole process to account more. Is it just by extending the consideration or the time to receive evidence of that there, those 15 days, or are there other ways you think that we could do that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to give the impression that the 15 days is the only way. I think that's just the simplest and most straightforward way of improving scrutiny within as quickly as possible. Also, things like there are ways of improving that would require a bit more interparliamentary work. For example, how the refusal of consent is notified to Westminster. It would be good to ensure that there was a formalised process in that would allow our refusals to be recorded in the same way as the Senate and the Scottish Parliament.
So theirs are recorded. Their kind of disapproval of the consent motion, but ours aren't. And I know you did say that from Annex A, but why is that there?
So I'm not entirely clear in every case, but there's no requirement. There's no requirement to communicate a lack of consent, number one, and number two, that if, say for example, in the case of the Advanced Research Bill, if the legislative consent motion hasn't been brought, then I, as a researcher, certainly noticed that I couldn't tell if it. I couldn't easily tell. I had to work quite hard to work out if the legislative consent motion had been brought, whether it had been granted or refused. So even just that little bit of clarity would be extremely helpful, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Thank you for that, Emma. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Nicola. I've got Sinead, Bradley, and then I've got Joanne.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Emma, for that. And you did rightly point out about not just the delay, but the transparency piece. I think we were very alert to the delay, but that piece also you're talking about, whilst committees have been doing their level best to try and preempt, it hasn't been a healthy environment to, and even using stakeholders' times and energies to blindly speak to issues isn't really good practice. I think that's fair. And I can see how then any proposal to extend the time then moves everything along, so you can actually wait until such a time that you're speaking directly to whatever it is as presented, as opposed to speculating. But and I don't expect this would be fair to ask of Emma, Chair, but it might be worth noting that in terms of then the standing orders and the transparency piece, are there any I suppose examples of where that transparency is worked into standing orders in other places? So therefore, you know, the duty to report is clearly defined in standing orders, or is that just procedurally something that's been adopted? I don't know if you have any comments you could maybe add on that point, Emma. Thank you, Chair.
So in the standing orders, the requirement to lay a legislative consent memorandum is expressed in terms of must, but the 10 days is a may. So I think that is where the problem can sometimes arise. So a legislative consent motion must be laid, but when it is laid, it is not as strictly regulated in our standing orders. It's similar in the standing orders of the other devolved legislations as well, or legislatures as well.
I'm sorry, I'm just coming. Do they have anything in their standing orders that dictates about the transparency piece? Like if a report of a Hansard report or a vote in the committee has to be, you know, set against any outcome or laid somewhere publicly, is there any good example of that? I'm just thinking from a standing orders perspective.
No, so neither the Scottish Parliament nor the Senate have any requirement to notify the Westminster in any specific way. What tends to happen is the clerks write to each other, and it's those letters. The Scottish Parliament tends to attach an extract of proceedings explaining why, if refusal is being in play. So that tends to be the way it goes. But I'd have to double check, but I don't think there's anything in the standing orders that specifies that in any detail.
Okay, thank you. Is that you done, Sinead? Are you happy enough? Okay, thank you. Joanne, you're next.
Thanks, Chairman. Emma, thanks very much for the paper. Appreciate it. Could I just ask, in terms of information alone, how often is consent refused versus consent being agreed versus just no response? It'd be useful to know that.
So that is quite difficult based on what I've just said. So say, using again the example of the ARIA bill, it's not clear up until a couple of days ago, it wasn't clear whether a legislative consent motion had been brought forward and refused, or whether one had not been lodged.
So essentially, in terms of your research, the stuff that you've been able to find has all been circumstances whereby it has been agreed and gone through the committee and all that. So the other stuff hasn't really been recorded in any meaningful way at all. Okay, yeah. That's fine. You see, Chairman, it seems to me, and I kind of mentioned this the last time I was here, that a lot of this is of our own making because we're the ones setting the timeframes. So it seems to me kind of there's a clear-cut path through this that we amend standing orders accordingly to allow committees to properly address these issues. We probably, in the course of a report, recommend that the Assembly website is updated. I mean, the Scottish Parliament doesn't seem to go into the level of detail that the Welsh Senate does. So maybe there's a happy medium there somewhere, and I'm not clear that we're achieving it, but I think that we probably should be updating our website more than we are and including the LCMs on them. But in practical terms, Emma, and this is not a question for you, it's for the committee officials. Obviously, we were meeting with people from the House of Commons and people from the House of Lords with regard to discussion on where things were and the timeframes that things were going to take to allow our committees a bit more time and to make the process a bit more fluid and engaged. Have we made any progress on that?
either yourself or Paul can answer that if you have the answer.
Well, Paul attended the meeting with the PACAC representatives last week, but it's my understanding that this was not discussed. Please correct me.
Yeah, so there's a couple of relevant things here. So the committee has written to both the House of Lords and the House of Commons flagging up these concerns, and in fact has specifically addressed the point of transparency because, as Emma has pointed out in her research briefing, the fact that there's a bill that requires the Assembly's consent, our arrangements at the moment rely on the Minister bringing forward a memorandum and telling the Assembly that, and there are instances where either that's only happening very late or it hasn't happened at all. And for that reason, the committee has suggested to Parliament that in addition to ministers being required to come and tell the Assembly about it, Parliament should tell the Assembly, and that meant if the minister didn't do what they're supposed to do, then we'd still know about it, and there'd be therefore the greater opportunity for committees to have that extra time. So there's a future meeting, I think, that is due to take place with the chair of the House of Commons Procedure Committee, when there'll be an opportunity to reinforce these points that you've already made, and we hope, obviously, that they'll respond to those sympathetically.
But presumably in that correspondence or in that meeting, Paul, we can ensure that it's not just about notifying the relevant committee clerk or chair, whoever it's going to be, but it's also about, insofar as it's possible, them indicating a time frame for when they anticipate they need a decision, so that committees can schedule it in rather than shoehorning it in either at the last minute or at the expense of other stuff, because we're now hitting a pressure point in committees, and it shouldn't be like this. So if we had some indication of timeframes from them, then that affords committees to better prepare their work programme.
Absolutely it does, and the committee has made that point in the correspondence to both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It's not just being told about these bills, their existence, but it's also been informed about the timescale for dealing with them so that we can maximise the time available to us for carrying out our scrutiny.
Okay, so all of that's on us, Chairman. That's dead on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. Rosemary?
Yeah, thank you. Mine was in relation to the ministers bringing forward these bills to us. What happens if they don't bring them forward?
Well,
what's the core problems there?
Well, twofold really. The procedural response, the procedural avenue open is that if the minister fails to bring the LCM within the 10 days, an MLA may do so. And then things would carry on just as if the minister had done it. The difficulty is that, as again, to go back to that example of the LCM that was brought in either yesterday or a couple of days ago, if you're an MLA, and you're thinking the minister hasn't lodged this yet, should I go ahead and lodge the LCM myself? How do you work out whether the minister has just missed the 10-day window, or whether the minister is intending to bring forward a different bill, or whether the minister has just not brought forward the LCM? So you as an MLA might then need to correspond with the minister to work out if you should or shouldn't, or if you bring the LCM forward, is it going to be completely overridden the next day because the minister brings forward his or hers?
So there are consequences then. And again, that issue would be got around if we were being notified by Westminster that this needs to be brought forward to the various legislative assemblies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary.
There's a communication. There's also the importance of communication between the two, between Westminster and Stormont. That's not happening.
Yes, absolutely, Rosemary. Okay, Paul, did you want to come in?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to come back on that point about what are the consequences such then if a minister doesn't lay the memorandum. And I mean, the Speaker's been clear in this in the past. Ministers are under a duty to lay a memorandum and inform the Assembly where they're aware of a bill going through Westminster that requires the Assembly's consent. This research paper is very useful because it shows to us that there are instances of specific bills which have gone through Parliament which required the Assembly's consent and which the Assembly was never informed about. And I know the Speaker has had significant concern about that, and I imagine that that's something when this committee comes to working out its conclusions, they'll want to draw attention to that, because it does mean that there was an expectation the Assembly would have a chance to give a view, and it was never offered the opportunity to give that view, and that bill has become law without the input of the Assembly. So when we think about the scrutiny role of the Assembly, I suppose that's quite a serious matter.
No, and that's fair enough. So I think one of the, or some of the issues that we need to deal with, first of all, are we're asked to give consent to an LCM when we haven't seen legislation, so we need to fix that. It sounds to me like we also need to fix standing orders as well, so we need to see an example of that. We also need to write to the British House of Commons asking that bills are sent to us, sent to the Assembly, and not just the relevant minister, because it's the Assembly who needs to make the decision. And I mean, frankly, this is down to us, because the way it was just custom and practice, but it's also the way standing orders were written, that it was down to the minister to bring it forward so the Assembly could consent, and that's completely wrong. And then the last thing is, it will be in the report, but certainly we need to come back to what we can do in the here and now. Rosemary, you were looking back in again?
No, that's okay.
Okay. Nicola? Yes, go ahead, Nicola.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick question, maybe to Paul or Emma there. Why would Westminster be putting through legislation and not letting the Assembly have sight of the LCM? Do you have examples of that there, and can you maybe give a guess as to why, even if I'm not sure if there are actual reasons?
Chair, the process that exists for us, it's set out in a devolution note, and the way this is supposed to work is that it's the UK government that is legislating, and it takes a view that it thinks, rather than just legislate in England on this issue, that it wants to also include Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And in those circumstances, what they do is they consult with the local minister here and say, we want to do this, but for that to happen, we usually wouldn't do it without the consent of the Assembly, so will you please go to the Assembly and ask them will they consent? What we're aware of is that in instances the Minister actually hasn't come to the Assembly and asked the Assembly to give its consent, and therefore the bill has just proceeded through Parliament and has been made and has extended to Northern Ireland without the Assembly ever knowing that that Minister was supposed to come and ask us for whether we would give consent or not. Now, in theory, Parliament actually at the last stage, if there hadn't been any consent from the Assembly, would remove the provisions that relate to here. But we know recently that that hasn't happened. The UK government currently, I don't think, is minded to change legislation where the Assembly haven't given its consent. And I think there are lots of factors at play there, but Brexit is one of them. It's really changed the nature of these LCMs, which in the past tended to be on more routine or technical matters, but have become more frequently now more significant or constitutional type issues. So I don't know why ministers necessarily wouldn't have done what they need to do. We might speculate that perhaps there's issues with getting agreement in the executive, and perhaps that's the reason why they haven't come. We don't know why the UK government don't take Northern Ireland out when we haven't given our consent, but again, I think we might speculate that the current government isn't always very concerned if the Assembly hasn't given its consent and decides to legislate anyway.
Okay, Paul, just before you go, are there any examples of the UK government not approaching a minister?
We don't know that. I mean, our assumption is that they always will, because that's what they say their approach is. And when they publish the bills will say this bill will require the consent of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and therefore we will be asking the Northern Ireland Minister to do this. We have written to the executive as part of this inquiry because we did think it would be useful to have their views, because if there was an issue where perhaps ministers weren't being contacted in the first place, then I suppose this committee would want to reflect that. But as yet we haven't had a response back from the executive, so we can't say for certain whether that is the case.
Okay, thanks for that, Paul.
Ciara? Kira, you need to take yourself off mute. And anybody's not talking, can you put yourself on mute, please?
Just Paul, following on from Nicola there, you mentioned obviously it may increase due to Brexit. Is there a possibility that we can find over the last few years with regards to LCMs proceeding without consent here in the north, and what they are, and just what's the scale or what's the level of how that's taken place over the past few years? Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I think some of that information is probably captured in the updated annex that you were sent. So to give a couple of examples that we can see in that, there was the, and Emma can keep me right on this, being the author of the paper, she will know this best, but for example, there was the Internal Market Act. That was one where the consent of the Assembly should have been sought, but where at no time that was actually brought by means of a memorandum to the Assembly's attention. Just looking down here, I can see that the Trade Act 2021, that was another one where there would have been an expectation that the Assembly would have been asked to give its consent, but no memorandum was ever laid, and therefore the Assembly didn't have that opportunity. And we can say that, but we also know that both of those bills are things that arose out of Brexit. They were policy responses by the UK government to having left the European Union.
Okay, thank you, Kira. Any other questions for Emma? Not at this stage. Emma, listen, just on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for your very detailed papers and indeed for your attendance at today's committee. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just follow up in the end at the end of this session. So Emer, do you want to read back some of the issues that were raised as part of Emma's paper and our attendance at the committee and some of the items that we need to discuss going forward?
Yep. So first of all, can members confirm, based on what Emma has provided today, if they're minded to explore as part of the inquiry whether they think there's scope to incorporate more time where possible into the parameters of the existing Standing Order 42A, which would enable committees to carry out more scrutiny?
Yeah. I think everybody's agreed on that. Okay, Emma, and the next thing about standing orders?
The next question for members was whether or not they're content to write again to the Executive. The Executive has not yet responded on the LCM inquiry and asked whether it wishes to comment on the issues raised in Emma's research report and to comment on the fact that it would likely be referred to in the committee's inquiry report.
Yes, we can do that again.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Emma, is that all you, or sorry, Emer, is that all you had?
Yes.
Okay, so I had down as well a possible change in standing orders to include what the new standing order would look like, and also within that change of standing orders, what we need to do using the Welsh and Scottish models of writing to Westminster. So come have a look at some examples of those, please.
Yeah, certainly.
And the website?
Oh yes, Joanne, the website as well on the LCMs.
Noted, thank you.
Brilliant. Has that captured everything that members raised, or even those who didn't speak? Is there anything else to think that we need to do? No? Okay, so we've got Chris in. Is he here early or is he waiting?
Yeah, he was due to start at 2:55, Chair.
Okay, so Chris is already here, so I think if he's available, we should bring Chris in to talk about his experience of the Pmbs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Chris, are you there?
Yes. Hello. I was working away there, Chair. So don't feel
don't feel that you were leaving me late or anything like that. There's no worries in that regard.
So sorry about that, Chris.
You're grand.
Fairly substantial piece of work, as I'm sure you were listening to. So on page 17 of our pack, I just want to refer you to Emer's paper. And again, Chris, thanks for coming to the committee today and taking the time to talk to us about your experience of the PMB process. So it's over to yourself.
Thanks very much, Chair. I hope I'm not the only MLA feeding back to you.
No,
but,
you're not. We've had a few. We've had a few.
That's good. Start by thanking you for inviting me to contribute to the committee review of private members' legislation. It's my intention to offer very brief and hopefully constructive feedback on my experience of the PMB process to date. I should say at the outset that I found Bill's office staff helpful, particularly at consultation and final proposal stage. I submitted a final proposal for a PMB to include teachers in fair employment legislation by the deadline for final proposals of June 2021. I think mostly due to the pressures on the legislative process, I have, however, yet to receive drafting assistance with what ought to have been a fairly short bill. But as I say, I acknowledge that is due to a unique mandate period of time and extreme pressure on the Bill's office. So my feedback for the PMB process, acknowledging that, would be as follows. I think we could look for better deadlines so that the PMB process could have better deadlines to ensure that the bill has more opportunity to pass. I know it's not always, but they are best estimates at times given forward work programmes, but and I accept that MLAs are at liberty to submit proposals in advance of the deadline, but if you're going to have a deadline in place, it would seem to make sense that after that, if that deadline is met, that there is a realistic possibility of the bill getting to drafting assistance stage and assembly processes stage. Two, I would say clear communication. So, for example, if and I, may have missed it in considered correspondence, but if it's going to take 5 months between final proposal stage and drafting assistance stage, then make that really clear to a proposing MLA, and I suppose I mean really, really clear to give the MLA the opportunity to try to progress drafting themselves if that's possible, and if indeed it is a relatively straightforward bill. Three, I would say adequate resourcing. I think it'd be really useful if we were to benchmark whether there are adequate human resources at the Assembly to effectively pass private members' legislation. The staff here or there are undoubtedly committed and skilled in what they do, but are there enough of them? I think that's maybe something to benchmark and to look at if we're serious about facilitating private members' legislation, and I think we should be. I think there's been some really important private members' bills progressed into law over my time at the Assembly. And four and final would be to consider whether it would be suitable and possible to provide MLAs with access to legal advice. So committees at committee stage can access Assembly legal services, which can be extremely helpful for scrutiny of a bill. But my understanding is that as it stands, individual MLAs can't access such legal advice at the various stages of bill progression. So I think that might be useful as well. Hopefully that's of some use to you, Chair.
It has been very useful, and even just for your own information, we've had a couple of MLAs who are bringing bills forward, and many have, certainly like yourself, commended the staff at the Bill's office and the Bill's team, but I think all have raised the issue of resources and that. So I'm going to open it up to members if you have any questions or observations for Chris.
I usually sit on the other side of this, so go easy on me.
Oh, no.
Is this payback time?
I know. Anybody wants to stick a boot into Chris, go forward. Just not straight up. Okay. Nicola, where you go?
I've waited a long time for this, Chris. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to jump in. No, it's just on your point there about drafting the legislation. I think isn't it outsourced to like just some other company who drafted? Have you any kind of ideas how that could maybe be improved? If that's one of the bigger stumbling blocks you've
So to break that stage down, Nicola, the final proposal is submitted, and then Assembly Bills Office staff work on drafting instructions, and then drafting instructions are outsourced to drafters. So I think both stages can take quite some time, but as I said, in my experience, and I hope this doesn't sound too much like a complaint, it's just an observation. I submitted a final proposal in June, and it's been, and since then, the Assembly Bills Office have been, because of the amount of bills and the pressures, etc., have been working on drafting instructions. So I can only speak to that length of time. I'm not sure how long it takes once those drafting instructions are outsourced to drafters. But there's a couple of stages there that can take quite some time. So I think, in my experience, it would have been helpful if the Assembly drafting instruction stage had have been quicker, I suppose. But that's just an observation. It's not a criticism. And then I think the drafters are obviously experienced individuals as well sourced by the Assembly. Having more people working on the drafting instructions and more people working on the drafting of the bill is going to allow us to do more private members legislation, but there'd be a question of cost there and budget. I guess that's why I've suggested maybe it'd be useful to benchmark how our resources in the Assembly Bills Office and our access to drafting compares with other jurisdictions.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair enough point, Chris, and something that we should definitely take on. And you and I from our committee in education know just how technical bills can become and how you do need all that kind of help and those different eyes on it, but also how there can be delays when a bill's going through and everyone wants to see it getting through but still getting the due scrutiny in that. So I think that's a very valid point, and some our committee here, the Procedures Committee, should take forward. So thanks for that. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Nicola. I've got Rosemary next, then I've got Joanne.
Thank you, and thank you, Chris. That was really interesting what you said. Chris, you spoke there about your experience. You talked about perhaps there would need to be more drafters for the bills, etc., and maybe more instruction in relation to drafting a bill. Now, that there's very well, but that's very well and acceptable and good. Do you ever see the time then when the Assembly, we're having difficulties this mandate in relation to getting through our PMB process? Do you think if we have more people drafting, more bills, etc., surely we're going to be overclogging the system, so to speak?
Yeah, that's maybe a fair question, Rosemary, and maybe something to look at is, I think the Speaker's Office and the Bills Office, to be fair to them, were, with the short mandate available, we're really interested in fairness, and I can't fault that. So I think the criteria on which they progressed bills was in a linear order. But is there a way to assess the complexity of a bill, the likelihood of a bill passing? I haven't given that as much consideration as maybe I should have, Rosemary, but I think as you know, I think that maybe does merit further consideration and again, examination whether other jurisdictions have a bit more of more criteria in terms of what the way in which you might allocate assistance. Like I'd be keen to make sure that that's as open a process as possible, because I really do support private members being able to progress legislation. I think it's an important counterbalance to relying on an executive to produce legislation, which has had varying levels of effectiveness over the years, to be diplomatic. A few may put that stronger, but I think there may be merit in exploring whether there's more criteria can be put in play. I don't want to personalise it too much to me, but as I said, I felt like the proposal I was trying to bring forward was a relatively short amount of clauses and a short bill, whereas, as Nicola referred to earlier, there's some really complex bills as well that are going to take up more resources and allocation.
Yeah, so that leads me on then. Do you think there should be a cut-off point in the mandate for accepting Pmbs?
Yeah, I guess that would be consistent with what I've said in terms of deadlines, Rosemary. Yeah. Now, where that cutoff, where that deadline is, that can be tricky to identify, because you can have best laid plans on how many years of a mandate we may have, and as we saw in the last one, profoundly regrettably, we didn't have all 5 years to progress legislation. But yeah, I think having a cut-off point that is adequately in advance of the end of the mandate is clearly important. And I suppose if you everybody will work up to deadlines, and you're still going to have a lot towards the end. But I do think that can maybe be further in advance of when it was.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary.
Okay, thank you, Rosemary. Joanne, you're next.
Thanks, Chairman. Hi, Chris. How are you?
Hi, Joanne.
I'm not going to get the boot in either. Chris, I'm going to ask you this not as somebody who has got a proposal for a private member's bill, but as somebody who has sat on committees for many years, and indeed who chairs a committee now. So set your own bill aside, because
sure.
I would impinge on the question. We're getting kind of contradictory and mixed messages with regard to whether or not members who are bringing forward a private member's bill should be a member of the committee. And some folks are saying it's been profoundly helpful. Other people are saying it might skew the committee. And there are some concerns that actually, if a committee is discussing a bill, it's maybe a bit more difficult if the member is there, and maybe it just makes things a bit more awkward in terms of asking questions and so on whenever people are coming in to give evidence. Do you have a view in general about that, or any thoughts on that issue that we should take note of and take account of?
I think that's a really good question, Joanne. I haven't experienced it, I don't think, in my time. What I have experienced, I suppose, is party colleagues proposing, not just me, but other party colleagues proposing private members' legislation. I think what I would say in relation to that is we have to be professional, for want of a better word, whether it's a member of our committee, whether it's a member of our party. We have to place ourselves in the role of committee member. I had to do it recently as committee chair, and yet you have to perform the statutory functions you have as a committee member, regardless of whether the proposer is a member of your committee, a member of your party, or just a really nice person, which can happen as well. We experienced today. So yeah, I think you have to focus on the role, and I think it would be unfortunate if someone had to be precluded from bringing forward a proposal if they were a member of the committee or some other rule that would prevent them from doing so. But I think it's a really good question, and it's probably something that you have to ready yourselves for if that is a situation that you encounter. You have to really not that we would ever do anything other than be professional and perform our roles on the committees, but I think in that situation you have to have a real impartiality in that regard.
So you think it's important that in those circumstances, whether if the member's already a member of the committee, then really people need to be very clear on the boundaries. Are you saying that if in circumstances where somebody was not a member of the committee, should they be permitted to be a member ex officio, or should they just be able to come in and give evidence as and when required?
Okay, I get what you're saying there. In order to actually sit through the process and things like that, I guess we could watch on, and I think it is prudent for a committee to engage as regularly as they can with a private members bill proposer, because it can be it's obviously a formal stage of the bill, but it can be a fairly informal process at times as well, in terms of trying to get to exchange possible amendments between each other. In my experience, most of the time, committees are keen to perform that impartial role and do generally have a consensus of trying to improve the bill, and enhance the bill. So I think an informal, regular engagement with the bill proposer, I think, can be adequate. I don't know that it would be necessary for them to sit ex officio on the committee per se.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chairman.
Thanks, John.
Okay, so again, Chris, I haven't received any indications from any other members, so I just want to thank you for coming front to committee and sharing your experience with us. There's a lot of issues that have been raised, some additional to what's already been raised that certainly we'll need to consider. So again, sorry for keeping you waiting, Chris.
No, you're granted. Thanks again, Chair, for the work that you guys are doing on this. I think it is a really important aspect of the work up at the Assembly, so thank you guys for reviewing it.
Chris, thank you. So members, of pages 33 to 38, we've received written submissions from Pam Cameron, the Finance Committee and the DUP. Are you content to note all these at this stage and return to them when the committee is considering all the issues raised in evidence? Is that okay? Just agree to note those. Any other comments or further comments that members want to make? Or are you just content to agree to proposed next steps set out in Emer's paper?
Yep.
Agreed? Okay.
Agreed.
So, Emer, is Kellie Armstrong there?
I can just see right now that a mobile has joined. Can I just double check?
That's Kellie Armstrong.
It is.
Okay, thank you, Kellie. So, Emer, we'll bring Kellie in now that she's joined and then come back to the EU-related issues and the consent decisions. Is that fair enough?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, Kellie, listen, you're very welcome to the committee. I don't know if you've heard all of Chris's, your colleague's submission there to the Procedures Committee, but without further ado, I just want to welcome you on. We can't see you, but I'm assuming that's because you're calling from your mobile. So if you just, the way in which we've done this previously is just for sponsors of MLS, your sponsors of private members' bills, just to talk about their experience of bringing forward a PMB and particularly what you found helpful and what you think we need to do in order to make the process better, not just for bill sponsors, but indeed for the Assembly. So over to yourself, Kellie.
Thank you very much, Chair, and apologies, I'm coming to you on the phone. I've just come out of quite a big meeting with the South Eastern Health and Social Care Trust, and thank you very much for making time for me. As you say, I am a sponsor of a private members bill, the Integrated Education Bill. I'm very fortunate that the bill is in later stages. It's cleared to committee stage now and will be heading for consideration stage hopefully in the new year. Just for a bit of a background on the bill that I've gone through, it was a bit of a strange bill. I don't mean that because of the content, but it's because of it fell between a few stools. So it started in 2016, and then, as you know, we had another election in 2017, and then we had the Assembly gap of 3 years. So my bill spans all of that. Now, I have to say that as a sponsor of a bill, it didn't stop the bill from going forward because we were able to complete quite a lot of work during the time that the Assembly wasn't sitting. What I would say as a bill sponsor is continuity as a sponsor is key. And what I mean by that is I did have a number of different bills office staff have helped me with this bill, and they have changed over that period of time. As you can imagine, that's quite an extensive time. Not unexpected, but the continuation and the that ongoing sort of continuation would have been helpful if there had been the same people involved. Up until the drafting point of view, I found the system extremely helpful. I have to say that our bills office was fantastic. I did go through the whole Assembly system. I didn't go outside of the system. Nobody else wrote the bill for me. We did the consultation with a lot of support from our bills clerk. We did all of the work, ticked all the boxes of what we had to do for the Speaker, and then we got to the drafting stage. We got one of the expert panel of drafters who did the drafting of the bill. Fantastic. Then we came to the first stage and into Assembly, and then, as you know, where we are now with the bill. What I would say is the difference between the early stages, the pre-drafting stages, and what we have now is significantly different, and that continuity of service or the continuity of support is significantly different, and that I don't believe I understood it. That could be my fault, but one of the things that would have helped me, and I think helped the members of a committee, would be if there was clear guidance provided for MLAs to explain exactly all of the processes that you need to go through, so that you as a bill sponsor, and even if you are an ordinary MLA or a minister or a member of a committee that's scrutinising exactly all of the processes that bill will have gone through before it gets to first stage reading in the House. So, for instance, things like you have to put it forward to the Speaker to make sure that he's content with it before you then go forward with your consultation. The consultation itself is, the Bills Office will help you with the content of that, that it will have been through scrutiny. The drafter will have gone through it. There will have been legal advice provided. There have been many hours of Bills Office work on it. Before it even gets to that first stage. And I think a lot of people, with my bill, I have found that some MLAs have said that the consultation wasn't done. It was. They've said that the drafting was poor. The drafting wasn't poor. There was a very expert drafter was brought in by the Bills Office to draft this bill for me. And I would wish that if we had guidance that was provided, they give a list of all of the stages. Now, you can find this if you actually go hunting on the Assembly website, but it needs to be spelt out. So those MLAs don't actually criticise our Bills Office staff or drafts people who are working very hard for us. And I think that would be very helpful. After drafting, once I've gone into, obviously, the Assembly procedures, one of the things that I have found sorry, that's not me. One of the things I have found is it's like night and day with the type of support that you have. And I have to admit our Bills Office did handhold me through the early stages and through drafting. But after that, then it is a very different process. I wasn't aware of that, and it has caused some frustrations for me. So I don't get access to the same level of legal advice as a committee can get access to. And what I would say, rather than having a legal person or legal advice specifically available for private members' bill sponsors, if the Assembly's already paying for an amount of legal advice, would there be an option for a percentage of that advice to be set aside for private members' bills, so that a member may know that they have access to X number of hours, whatever that may be, and then they can choose to use those number of hours, for instance, for drafting? Because when you get to that stage, before consideration stage, there is maybe improvements that can be made, but because you don't have access to a drafter and because you don't have access to legal service directly, have contact with those, it makes it quite difficult. And we are working through bills clerks who are also giving evidence and supporting committees or other MLAs who are bringing through amendments. And I just wonder, could we not have that continuity of staff? And I don't know, maybe there is something about qualifications at this stage, but if you have a bills clerk or clerks who are working with you from the very start, can they not come through with you to after drafting? Because that continuity needs to happen, because as a private member, you don't have access to a department. you're not part of a committee. You are there on your own, and I appreciate that's what happens when you have a private member's bill coming forward. But it was only after that my bill was drafted and we started to work with other parties to bring forward amendments that it was made very clear to us that we didn't have that type of bills office support. For instance, there's something that's quite, and I still haven't got to the bottom of it yet, with the EFM. So who's responsible then for rewriting the EFM if the amendment that's brought forward at consideration stage is brought forward by a committee or another MLA or a minister? And if it was a minister bringing it forward, there'd be a whole team that would be bringing forward the EFM update. But when you're a private member, when you're coming forward with your own legislation, you don't have access to the legal services, and rightly so, that a committee would have access to or a minister would have access to. So how do I, as a private member, then amend the EFM when it's somebody else's amendment and somebody else's legal advice that I don't have access to? I think that our bills process is good. It just, after drafting, I think that there needs to be a little bit more consideration of the private member's bill and that process, access to legal advice, producing guidance and having some sort of consistency through the process. Apart from that, I've found the bills process unbelievably stressful, as you can imagine. It has been not a fun time. It does give added difficulties, but that's the risk you take when you take on a private member's bill. It has been quite difficult, I have to say, in the House when you're doing your bill. There are no comfort breaks, so I sat for 7 hours. Now, there was a break for question time, thank goodness, but it's a long time to sit in the House, to concentrate for all that length of time, and you're not like a minister. You don't have anybody else in the box. You may well have staff here elsewhere in Parliament buildings, but you're sitting there for hours on end, and I think even just as the Assembly, something we should consider is the same way as you would have it in any other council or other workplaces. Every 2 hours or 2.5 hours, there should be a comfort break built in, especially when something's going on for so long. I'm trying to think if there's anything else, Chair, there. The other things I would just say is I do believe that we do need drafters within our own Assembly. I found that the drafter that I had was superb, but there has been criticism to say that it's a style of writing, or because they've come from a Westminster background, that's how Westminster does it, that's not maybe how we do it. I don't have control as a private member's bill sponsor over that, and I think it's maybe something that we do need to consider going forward. So it might need investment that we have our own drafters. I think the number of bills that have come through would make that value for money, but it's access to legal services as well. So I genuinely have no idea how much all that could cost. I'm sure it'd be quite expensive, but it might be a less cost than it would be to have to go out to independent experts that are on our panel.
Thank you, Kellie. That was quite comprehensive. So I'm going to throw it open to members for any questions or observations. Emer, have you got anybody who's indicated? Because I can't see in the screen.
Yeah, Rosemary, Sinead, Joanne.
Okay, Rosemary, go ahead.
Thank you. Maybe this is my ignorance rather than what you've said, Kellie. But Kellie, and you may not know the answer, why do we not have drafters within the Assembly? You're more experienced in the Assembly than me.
I genuinely don't know. I don't know whether that's just we've been hit with so many private members' bills coming through, because I know that within, I'm not sure to be honest, Rosemary, I know that the Office of Legislative Counsel works across all bills, whether it's minister or private members' bills. But as far as drafters, maybe it's just because there's so many private members' bills coming forward, it makes sense now for us to consider having them internally.
Yeah. Kellie, I appreciate what you said about, more consultation and consistency in legal advice. I can understand that totally and why one would need it. But given the current pressures on the Assembly business, have you any suggestions on how plenary time might be maximised and prioritised towards the end of a mandate? We're rushing now to get as many bills, etc., passed as possible, and you're aware of that very much. Any ideas how to maximise it?
I think, to be honest, Rosemary, that at this time this is a bit of an unusual one, because we've had that 3 years missing, and we're sort of squeezing all of what we have now into this last period of time. But I have to say the Bills Office and the Speaker's Office in any normal mandate provide you with a timetable, and if you as a private member stick to that timetable, so you go in very early on in the mandate, you put down your PMB proposal, you're told whether or not that proposal is within scope of the Assembly, and then you start the work on your bill. If you stuck to that timetable, without the 3 years, I would probably have had my bill through in 2018. As a result of the gap and the rush now, it feels like there's an awful lot of private members' bills coming through. There are certainly an awful lot of executive bills coming through. But I think what the Speaker's doing now is actually quite good, because what he's doing is he's getting as many bills as possible through to second stage. They can then come back in the next mandate. So it means then instead of people having to develop something and take quite a while to do that, that they're actually on the ground running from day one in the next mandate. Now, I don't know whether we'll bring forward, me and my researcher will bring forward another private member's bill in the next one. We would be starting afresh, but we're very aware of the work that's into that. I would say you need at least 18 months prior to first stage to go through all of the processes that you need to comply with for the Speaker before you get to the House. I just think that timetable, if anybody falls outside that timetable, it puts pressure on the end of a mandate. So I would be happier if the timetable was a little bit more firm.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. I've got Sinead next.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Kellie, that was really comprehensive. Thank you. A couple of points, but I'll just raise one of them with you. In terms of the person within the Bills Office that you worked with through that, getting it to the point where you draft the instructions, the instructions to draft, that person will have a good understanding of what you're aiming to achieve. And once it then leaves them, are you saying that there's a point in time you want to reconnect with them or stay with that person? Because I do hear what you're saying. It's one thing if it stays inside the Bills Office and they can work with you, but once it's issued out, and I would like to understand better who recommends who drafts, because I have seen this come up across a few members where there's stylistic problems, and the members not to be aware of that. Maybe one drafter would write it in a different way. So are you directed to somebody by the Bills Office, or how do you find out who can do the drafting for you? And then are you asking that you sort of keep in touch with one person in the Bills Office right through from inception to hopeful conclusion?
In my situation, the length of time that went past, obviously because of the 3-year gap, the person who I started off with in the Bills Office was promoted. Fantastic, glad to see they were promoted. They're a very good person. I then had a team within the Bills Office up to drafting. They finished with me at the drafting, after the first stage was read through, and I moved on to sort of like a post-drafting Bills team, and that continuity then changed. So if a new person is in, very good person, but I just would rather have had that continuity. And the reason for that is because the team who I was involved with up to the drafting stage helped me with the drafting instructions. They helped me with the EFM, all of that. Now, when it came to the drafter, I didn't choose the drafter. The drafter is picked through. So the Bills Office have an expert panel of drafters. And whatever bills are coming forward, I believe, now I could be wrong on this, but I believe how the process works is that they present the bill that's coming through to the drafters, and whoever comes forward and has the time and the capacity to take that drafting forward then comes forward. It happened to be the drafter that I was brought in contact with. So I didn't go looking for the person. The drafter who I got introduced to from the Bills Office was someone who had a particular interest in Northern Ireland and an interest in what my bill contained, because it followed on from work that they had done years before. So this was a person who knew the subject, knew what I was trying to do, was very clear on the drafting. I could go back and forward with them. They were very open to discussing with me things like why use a must there, why not use a may, the very detailed work on legislation. But I didn't have to go looking for that. That was provided for me through the Bills Office. So continuity of Bills Office staff from pre-drafting through to after drafting would just help, because the pre-drafters have a fantastic wealth of experience, because they've come through that consultation process with you. They've come through the drafting, the draft the draft instructions, and they've come through the development of the EFM. They have actually been involved with asking departments and other external stakeholders about the financial implications, and getting costings through for you. So they have really been very involved with the bill to that point, and then it changes to a different team, the post-draft team, that certainly have their own skills, but it's not the same person as before. Plus, that person, that Bill's Office person after drafting, is also advising any MLA who wants to put forward an amendment or the committee. So I feel for that person, to be honest, because they're cut between 3 or 4 different people or committees, because they have to retain a semblance of confidentiality. Like, I can't ask a Bill's person what the committee's asking them for, and the committee vice versa. That privacy is there, and it's very, very, very well protected. But to me, it just seems like that's an awful lot of pressure, when actually what I could be doing with is legal advice on the language again, and a drafter to look at amendments to make sure that there isn't any unintended consequences. So hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, Kellie, that really is helpful. Thank you. It paints a very clear picture for me. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Sinead. Joanne?
Thanks, Chair. Sinead has covered some of it, but Kellie, so can I just clarify with you, the reason that you had, the reason that the team changed post-drafting, was that purely because of promotion, or was promotion a happy coincidence? Is it standard practice that it's a different team post-drafting?
It seems to be standard practice, Joanne. So the pre-drafting team changed personnel because somebody got promoted. The very first person who I worked with got promoted, fantastic. And I got a couple of people who were involved with the bill before drafting. And to be honest, that was fine. That was fine, because we were still going through that big, long process before you actually get to first reading. But since then, it seems to be standard practice with the Bill's Office that it changes. So you leave behind your pre-drafting team and you move forward with a different team, a team that certainly they talk amongst each other. They bandy about, what would this word do? How could we change this? How could we make this amendment work? Or that's not going to work. But the thing is, that team that I have now, they're not there to provide me with legal advice. They're not there. They'll try to facilitate amendments, but they're facilitating amendments for the committee. They're facilitating amendments for private, individual members. It seems like quite a big job. And as a bill sponsor, you're not the minister. You don't have a department behind you. So it does feel quite isolating. And I think that we do need that continuity of support. If we were to say we're having private members' bills, we're allowing private members to bring forward legislation, then those private members, to be honest, do need to access an equal level of legal support and drafting support as a minister has, although the minister has that within their department. So it need to be something internally within the Assembly.
Yeah. I'm just kind of wondering, Chairman, if that's as a result of their different skill sets required.
Yeah.
And it might be worth, I don't know what engagement, I'm not clear yet, what engagement we intend to have or will have with the Bill Office going forward about this. So I presume they're coming in to give evidence in the same way as everybody else is, but that might be something that we should pursue with them about, is it a skill set issue, or should continuity trump skill set, and what's the rationale behind that? I think we do need to probe that a bit further, because every bill sponsor has kind of highlighted a similar issue.
They have, and there are a raft of similar issues that have been raised by all sponsors of Pmbs. Are any other questions for Kellie from anyone else? No? Kellie, listen, I want to thank you, because I understand that you came from a meeting with a local trust, which for anyone, regardless what trust it is, it's always a fairly intense process. So I want to thank you for your attendance at the committee, and indeed for all of the information and advice you give us, because we will be including that in a report. And just for your own information, but certainly for other members, we've got the Bill's Office and the Speaker at our next meeting on this very issue, so it'll certainly be helpful for us when we're having our deliberations with them. So Kellie, without further ado, I want to thank you again and wish you all the best. Good luck.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks all the best with it, guys. Thank you.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.
Okay, so agenda item 7, and sorry, before we move on to that, I'm not assuming it. we will, anytime an issue's been raised, we're going to bring that back before consideration of our own report and what we need to do and going forward. I mean, certainly one of the things I think we could certainly raise the issues that were brought forward today, but have been brought forward in previous, but certainly in advance of the meeting with the Bill's office, but more so with the Speaker, is in terms of the deadlines, the communication between final proposal and drafting, about the adequacy of the resourcing, and indeed about the outsourcing of drafters. I mean, I think that will be, I'm sure you'll agree, that will be helpful if we could get that for the Bill's office and the Speaker coming. And again, just in terms of any deadlines for Pmbs, and indeed, you know, what else we could do to clear up the guidance. And again, that goes back to information that we need to put on the Assembly's own website. So I've just taken notes as Chris and Kellie were speaking. Have I left anything out for people? Would that be clear enough or far enough to bring forward? Okay. Emer, have you got all that?
Yes, I've made
Chair, can I raise one issue, please?
Yes, go for it.
As you're talking there and going through the issues, something occurred to me about a conversation I had away years ago about the Bill office specifically, which was that there was a continuity issue. So the Bill office at that stage had been quite small. I don't know what size it is now. It had been quite small. And there was concern that if the people in there had massive levels of expertise, and that if they were moved or promoted, it was going to cause a business continuity problem for the Assembly. Part of the reason why there was a lot of personnel put through there was to make sure that the Assembly always had sufficient numbers of people trained to go into that office, because obviously if you don't have people in there who know what they're doing, you're at a crisis. And maybe that's one of the issues that we need to be pursuing.
I have that down, Joanne, in terms of have we got enough resources, and certainly part of that would be the continuity of staff, because I mean, the Bill's office, everyone is very complimentary, but they're also saying they're doing an awful lot of work and they need more support. And I think that's certainly something we could raise, but certainly continuity of staff and people and skills and expertise. Notwithstanding, notwithstanding, I want to see people getting promoted, but we do need some sort of consistency there.
The issue is that those people are highly skilled. Really specialist area of work, but the trouble is that you can't prevent people from being promoted. So how do we balance that? And the Assembly needs to manage that maybe a bit better from what we're hearing. Yeah, no, exactly.
Emer, so you've got a note of all that. Can we agree to just to make sure that the Bill's office and the Speaker and his staff are prepared for our next meeting, that they get a copy of some of those concerns in advance, so they may be able to respond to some of the queries that we've raised? Is that fair enough?
Yes, certainly. I've scheduled a meeting tomorrow afternoon, so I'll raise all the points that have been brought up today.
Yeah, because it would be really helpful for us to try and get a bit more detail when they attend the committee. So that much appreciated, Emer. Okay, so agenda item 7, I think we're on now. Yeah, so it's EU-related issues, section 6A of consent decisions. So you'll recall at our previous committee meeting that we considered issues in relation to the EU exit, in particular consent decisions, which relate to regulations made by the British government under section 6A of the 1998 Act that seek to limit the legislative competence of this Assembly. So just as a reminder, we consider whether procedures should be put in place in relation to consent decisions and agree to consult with the relevant stakeholders, which were ministers, the relevant statutory committee, the business committee, and again, for some reason, the CLG. So the purpose of today's meeting is that we need to consider our next steps. And I mean, Emer, you've helpfully put out at page 71 of our packs a background to section 6A and a summary of the responses from stakeholders. The committee has written to the executive seeking a response on a number of occasions, but in fairness to them, they're consistent. No response has been received. So members, given the relevant period for seeking a consent decision is 40 days, not excluding recess periods, and that freezing powers expire on the 31st of January 2022, it's estimated if recess periods apply in line with the current Assembly plan for recess, that the last date in which to draft regulations would have been provided to the relevant department would have been yesterday, the 30th of November. So in light of that, it appears that no such regulations are likely to be proposed, and noting that the timeframes in relation to making regulations under these powers will expire at the end of January, is the committee content to take no further action on this issue given all the issues that I've just outlined? Okay. There's really not much we can do without the Executive Office responding, so I'm just going to move on. So we've received our response, or our presentation from Kellie. In terms of agenda item 8, Ministers, Elections, Petitions and Concerns update. So again, members, you will recall at our last meeting on the 3rd, at our meeting on the 3rd of November, the committee agreed to defer this item and liaise with their party groups with regard to the issues paper. The committee further agreed that, having discussed with party groups, members would feedback comments in writing by the 24th of November, so that these be collated for discussion, and agreed at the meeting today. To date, the DUP have provided a response, which is at page 133 of our pack. At page 108 is a paper from Emer with annexes at pages 112 and 119. So I'm sure all members have taken the opportunity to have those discussions, and I'm now seeking comments or queries. So Joanne, you've had your paper in. I personally don't know where our paper is. I know we've had a discussion on the party with it, but I need to find that out and come back. I'm just going down all the parties that are here. So Sinead, Rosemary and Jeremy.
Chair, I'm happy to go if that's okay. I did bring it to the party and they've asked me to report back verbally to yourselves. So they basically are saying, you know, we're watching this coming through and it hasn't reached its final stage, so who knows what the final form might look like. And in terms of then some of the proposals that are in there, the party was looking, well, if the ministers are to be appointed, obviously we wouldn't be comfortable without any type of scrutiny mechanism there of some form. But they had said that it would be probably, we're conscious of time. So given that this needs to be addressed ideally ahead of any election, you know, so that there's time for this committee to act in terms of putting things in standing orders in place. But that said, they would prefer to see the final version of the bill, and then there's a consensus in the group that this is then quite a political agreement that has to be reached, and that it really wouldn't be the role of the Standing Orders Committee to try and facilitate that agreement, that there probably would need to be a conversation piece at leadership level across parties on what they agree, and then that we're directed then as a committee to act on that, be it as executive if they choose to do that.
Okay, so Sinead, we're as guilty of not hunting something in, but I'm not taking. I'm loath to take verbal updates. Even what you just said, the party need to put it in writing just to keep yourself right. So that would be my advice. Rosemary, has your party considered putting a written submission in?
Not as yet. We had a brief discussion again, and maybe quite similar to Sinead. We think it's maybe, how to say, above our pay grade. It's something for the leadership to talk about and take ownership of. So again, I will talk to them if they're interested in putting in a paper. Yeah. So
and Alliance aren't represented here either. And who else isn't represented? The Greens. So I think what we need to do is like we wrote to all the parties or all the whips of all
Sure,
the
can I
parties.
check, did we actually, because that was something that came up as well. I was bringing it and I didn't think that the whip had a copy. It might be worth just checking. We did.
Emer,
Thank you.
So, thanks for that, Sinead. Emer, can we just clarify what the process was?
Yeah, sorry. For clarification purposes, so the committee agreed that in the first instance, the members of the committee would discuss it within their party groups, bring those comments and discussions back to committee prior to any decision being taken to disseminate the issues paper any further.
Okay, so what I would suggest now is that given the DUPs really want to put a written response in, that members are asked to go back and bring it back to their parties for a written response. We could also, I would suggest, write out to all the whips saying that members of the Procedures Committee, and particularly for the whips who don't have members on the Procedures Committee, that the paper's given to them and they're asked for a response in writing, Emer, if that's at all possible. And then we need to come back to this at our next meeting.
Chairman.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that bill is going to, I mean, we should be hearing from about the final stage of that bill kind of at the end of January, maybe roughly, sometime in the new year, but like not that far in. Yeah. I'm wondering, like, everybody's kind of in a limbo, kind of clutching at straws till we actually see what that bill says. And it may be trying to circulate the paper and get people thinking about it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there can't be very many constructive conversations until we know what's actually in it. I think we all know it's obviously going to have to go to the leadership group. Yeah. But, you know, maybe we're asking people to come back on something when they really don't know what it's going to look like in the end.
Yeah, it's a bit like the LCM process, without sounding flippant. And I do understand members' concerns, I really do. But I would, again, circulate to them, and I think everybody will probably put the caveat, this all depends on what the final bill looks like, and then it'll go to our parties, because, like let's be honest, I mean, that's a process that's a democracy within parties, so, and that needs to be respected as well. So, just to recap, if we could write to the whips of all the parties, copy the paper, explain that we've asked for this, even the responses in writing, understand and accept that the final bill may not be known or seen until the new year, and certainly, you know, people have the ability, it's without prejudice until they see what the final outcome is, and certainly there was a view expressed by members that it would need to go to the party leaders before any amendments to standing orders or any other impact. I think that would, am I being fair to what people have said? Would that certainly encapsulate some of the concerns and comments that people have made? Yeah.
Yes, Chair, could I just add, I don't imagine, like Joanne had said, I don't think there's going to be very much richness in any returns that come forward, but I do think it's a worthwhile process of a written engagement, particularly to those parties who, like you rightly said, won't have access to those papers otherwise. Yeah, no, and that's my concern, Sinead. I would just think, even if it's just, I mean, if parties are putting in something to say, we haven't seen the bill, so we're going to hold a commentary until we see it, that's our prerogative. And with parties who aren't on this committee, and again with also parties who aren't on the CLG, which I still don't accept. It's a liaison group, it's not a statutory or standing committee. So I don't understand the prominence of the CLG in the same breath as the business committee or any other statutory or standing committee, but that's my own view. Okay, Emer, are we clear on what we need to do?
Yes.
Chairman, what do you call that group? It's not, you see, it's not just about it going to the party leaders. It's about it going to, you know, that group of party leaders that whenever they have an official, that official group, whatever it's called.
Yeah, the party leaders group. Yeah, the party leaders group.
Forum, I think.
Yeah.
It's that group it needs to go to, because Hopefully there needs to be a conversation there. I mean, the party leaders are already aware of it, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, it needs to go to a forum. But again, it needs to go to the party leaders as well, and the whips, because that's part of the assembly leadership. So, okay.
Can I double check,
So-
Chair, that we're writing out to the party whips and we're also writing out to the party leaders forum appending the issues paper?
Yeah.
Right.
But we're also saying, Emer, that as part of our committee deliberations, the parties have said that the view is that when, that a final commentary won't be made until full sight of the final bill is made, and it's all this commentary is without prejudice.
Yes.
Is that okay? Because I want to make sure I've faithfully reflected what members have raised. Okay, so we're going to move on. So our next item is, let me see. So, Emer, what we're going through, let me see, that's basically us.
Agenda item 9, just correspondence and chair's
Yeah.
business. Any other business?
So, let me see. There's a couple of items of correspondence. So, for example, at page 135 is a memo from Emer to the Youth Assembly advising members of the establishment of the Youth Assembly and the committees will be working across. So it's just for people to have that. And again, at pages 137 is an invitation from the Human Rights Commission on a human rights statement which will take place on Thursday 9th of December at 12 o'clock to 2 in the Long Gallery. And if members wishing to attend can sign up by using the invitation link. At page 138 is a memo from Emer to the ERA committee, inviting members to attend the Minister's webinar on the Green Growth Strategy. And the event took place on Monday and the invite was emailed to members prior to the event. And finally, in our table papers is a memo from Pmbs office offering members to attend an online session on personal security, which will be facilitated by the PSNI. The session will take place on Wednesday, the 15th of December from 10 to 11. Joining instructions are in the memo. So are members content to note these items? Okay.
Chair, sorry, Chair, just a very quick point. I'm sure it probably will happen anyway, but could we just write to the Youth Assembly, congratulate them and wish them well?
Yes, certainly.
Just we acknowledgement, because it'd be nice the fact that they've reached out to committees. Thank you.
Yes, no, that's a fair play to Sinead. That's a great suggestion. Emer, are you happy to pick this up?
Yes, certainly. Noted.
Okay, thank you. So our forward work programme, our next scheduled meeting is the 15th of December and it'll be the last before recess. And it will be busy. So in addition to more oral evidence sessions from MLAs and Pmbs, and we'll hear from the Bill's office and the Speaker as we outlined earlier. I have no business as chairperson's business other than Emer and Paul just to say, although I've raised this in correspondence, but I just want to share this with other members. We did raise it at the last meeting. But I would like to see the terms of reference for the CLG. And, you know, I understand it's a liaison group. Other members will probably feel differently, but I have an issue with it being elevated to the same status of a statutory and a standing committee. It's a liaison group where people catch up. Other than that, I'm quite clear about its remit, but I would like to see that done through the committee, that all members can see those terms of reference rather than me asking for them personally. So, is that clear, Emer? Are you content to take that forward, or maybe that's something Paul would need to do? I'm not sure.
Yep, no, we're content to take that forward.
Okay. Do any members have any other items that they wish to raise under AOB? No? Okay, so listen, thanks everybody for today. It was a fairly busy committee. So the date and time for our next meeting will be on Wednesday the 15th of December at 2:30. So without further ado, the meeting's adjourned, and stay safe everybody and take care, and thank you Emer and Paul for all your work. Take care, thank you, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.